We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Attawandaron peoples, on lands connected to the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. We acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada, and we accept responsibility as a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through our teaching, research, and community service.
So without further ado, I'll turn it over to a student representative from the Indigenous Studies program to offer a brief introduction of our speaker. So Taya, are you on the line?
Yep, can you hear me?
Perfect, yeah, great.
Okay, perfect. So together with the Department of Sociology, the Indigenous Studies program is pleased to welcome Dr. Kim TallBear to our colloquium series. She is an associate professor at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Native Studies, as well as a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience, and Environment. She is also Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow. Dr. TallBear has researched in the role of technoscience and settler colonialism and also studies the colonization of Indigenous sexuality. Dr. TallBear is the author of Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging, and the False Promise of Genetic Science. She regularly participates in US, Canadian, and UK media outlets by speaking on issues related to Indigenous peoples, science, and technology, as well as Indigenous sexualities. She is an enrolled member of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate in South Dakota. And I'm really looking forward to today's talk, and I would like to pass it on to Dr. TallBear to speak.
Hi. That was quick. Okay. So I'm going to get started right away and try not to tell too many stories as asides, because I like doing that. So the title of this talk is inspired by a founder of peace and conflict studies, and that's Johan Galtung. You can follow him on Twitter. His 2009 book, The Fall of the U.S. Empire and Then What, is kind of my de facto Bible these days. It's been on my desk the past few years as I try to understand what the different possibilities are for the decline of US empire, because in that book he just says, let's just choose a date. He says 2020, but in the book he says October 2020 for the kind of marked moment of fall. So this talk and my next book bridge my work on Native American DNA politics with newer work on thinking relations instead of the objects of sex, spirit, and nature. All three objects used to manage Indigenous people and many other people considered lower on the hierarchy of life. So this work looks at the violence done to all of us, not only to Indigenous peoples, and the violence done to the planet by settler hierarchies of life that inform genome research, which I looked at in that first book on Indigenous populations, but hierarchies of life that also inform the nature culture and material immaterial divides that ground settler colonial worlds. And I'm bringing all this together in the next book. So we can go to slide 2. Thank you. In April 2005, the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism issued a press release. They were opposing National Geographic's Genographic project launched that year, which aimed to sample 100,000 Indigenous people and other traditional peoples. That's a huge sample size, and those are not easy to get given the contentious issues around sampling. They wanted to trace the migratory history of the human species and map how the Earth was populated. Indigenous critiques of Genographic and other high-profile research projects charged researchers with ongoing colonial extractive research. Indigenous critics understand a lot, actually, about the history of anthropology, including its biological subfield, which was at stake in that project. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, massacre sites and graves were plundered for body parts and material artifacts that were used in scientific investigations. That ill-gotten biological property and cultural property continues to help develop the academic disciplines in nations we inhabit today. We should not just speak about these things as in the past. Indigenous critics of genome diversity research also know that the extractive research evolved to keep up with the times. Throughout the 20th century, Indigenous peoples globally have witnessed the practice of what we call helicopter research, that is, quick sampling without return of results or benefit to subjects. Indigenous DNA samples and data taken in earlier decades when ethics standards were viewed as more crude continues to be used and cited in contemporary investigations. So a lot of those things are well cited in newer papers that are coming out all the time, right? So we've got contemporary knowledge still being produced based on those colonial foundations. Of course, foundational narratives that script research questions and methods have changed little. Old school narratives of, and you'll be familiar with these, vanishing natives or the vanishing Indian, noble exploration, we still use explorer, exploration as if it's a positive. Knowledge for the good of all, that's a classic one in science. These narratives were forged in the fires of North American colonization, and they continue to animate 21st century science and the stories it tells about human history and nature. Indigenous critics of human genome diversity research know all of this, although they may not use the kinds of words that I use, people and community. They know that the disciplines broadly have been key to disrupting Indigenous relations with place, because the disciplines have justified the appropriation of so-called natural resources for nation building. I also build on the work of feminist theorists who really question this notion of objectivity that gets conflated with neutrality. That's a whole other talk, though. In short, Indigenous analyses and feminist analyses, queer analyses, often challenge the power of the sciences to narrate all of global human history, and with it, the exceptionalist nation, because these things are very tied up. We can go to the next slide. So, newer, seemingly more ethical research also has its cost. Community review and collaboration increases community benefit, and we are in a moment of really focusing, I think, on collaborative research in the academy. But this kind of research also takes Indigenous people's energy from other pressing governance projects, community development projects, cultural projects. It takes resources to build capacity to actually sit at the table as co-producers of disciplinary or academic knowledge, instead of serving as the raw materials for science. So yes, sitting at the table as a collaborator is definitely a step up, but it also comes at a cost. So ultimately, whose questions and whose institutional parameters drive the process of collaboration? Think about all the hoops you have to jump through for SSHRC funding or NSERC funding, the limitations on what they can fund, the limitations on what is considered knowledge worthy of producing. All of these things limit, constrain, and produce a lot of extra work for Indigenous communities to take part in collaborating in the settler states processes. We also have to think about, to whom does the financial and cultural capital of research accrue? Whose students are getting trained? Whose labs and institutions are getting built? Again, whose questions are getting asked and for what benefit? These are also pressing ethical questions, and I don't think that get asked often enough. We can go to the next slide. So on slide 4, we're going to talk about ontological risk. And this is the kind of risk that doesn't often get referred to in those informed consent forms that one signs before one holds one's arm out to have a needle inserted into it and blood drawn, or before one does an interview. We don't often talk about these kinds of risks. And I think these are the most fundamental risks, the ontological risks. So Indigenous critiques are really sophisticated of the colonial role of all kinds of disciplinary research. Indigenous people often in their pushback describe ontological risks that contribute to legal and material harm. They worry about the objectifying nature of human genome research, in which Indigenous and other quote unquote isolated peoples are used to represent ancient, less admixed populations, which implies that Indigenous peoples are less evolved. So I think on this slide, oh, it's not on this one, I think it's on another one. You see a quote by Spencer Wells from the Genographic Project talking about looking for, those 100,000 samples from isolated people that were somehow isolated from colonialism, which is a crude misunderstanding of how colonialism works. So when we're looking for isolated Indigenous or traditional peoples, people that are purer, whether that's biologically or culturally, we're actually implying that Indigenous peoples are less evolved, less part of the modern world, and ever at risk of vanishing. It's also a denial of colonial maneuvers. Indigenous critics notice these things, and they worry that the explicit racism that plagued the physical and social sciences of earlier centuries, which assumed evolutionary hierarchy among humans, the impending death of the Indian, unable to cope with modernity, and a divinely sanctioned westward expansion, which you see in these visuals, that these ideas continue to insidiously inhabit modern genomics. And these kinds of narratives deanimate us. They understand us as less alive. So I just pulled up some classic images that are very much in circulation when we think about the image of the vanishing American. And that painting, American Progress by John Gast, is really interesting, very much representing manifest destiny. You've got Columbia with a book of knowledge, all white, looking like an angel, but without wings, floating over the land, coming from the east where Europeans had already brought lightness, moving to the west, chasing the darkness away, the Indians on horseback. You've got the stagecoach and the steam engine coming behind, and all the agriculturalists in their covered wagons, right? This is American progress. A very romantic version of what genocide looked like. And then you've got a contemporary 21st century manifestation in that orchid Cellmark ad, which was placed in a national native kind of policy publication in the United States, went to all the federally recognized tribes, of which there are, I think, about 565. They were selling DNA testing to tribes for citizenship. Technologically and socially really complicated. So let's go to the next slide, where I talk a little bit more specifically about what I call settler colonial proselytizing. So settler disciplines were formed along with those kinds of narratives. They're both arising in the academy at this time in the 18th and 19th century. Again, disciplinarians are called upon to decide whether Indigenous people's religious freedom, for example, is actually being impeded by, say, loggers, fishers, or rock climbers at a sacred site. Such non-Indigenous disciplinary knowledges get privileged as truth, implied in opposition to Indigenous belief. Thus, it's obvious why the genome and other sciences with their considerable cultural power are viewed by Indigenous peoples as a potential threat. So they are, I think I forgot to say on the last slide, when I talk about disciplines being called upon to decide whether Indigenous people's religious freedom is being impinged upon, what you have is say anthropologists, historians, other kinds of disciplinarians being called in when Indigenous people go to court and try to prove, look, this site is sacred. We don't want rock climbers on what they call Devil's Tower, which of course there's a history of settlers renaming things as having to do with the devil or Satan when they have to do with Indigenous spiritual kind of claims, right? And this is very much a narrative of Indigenous people were backwards, they were heathens, they need to be converted to Christianity. So you've got all of that history kind of helping shape the landscape and the way that the landscape was renamed by settlers. And those things have not been reworked. We have not had a national reckoning or a global reckoning to come to terms with the way that this kind of 19th and earlier century forms of really egregious racism continue to inhabit our topography, continue to inhabit our national narratives, and continue to inhabit our disciplines, and therefore shape the people in the way that they study. And then they're brought into courts, and they're brought into grant reviews and all kinds of different processes of adjudication today to determine what counts as real knowledge, as real cultural practice. And so this is how I think this settler colonial proselytizing is continued today. So this kind of non-Indigenous disciplinary knowledges forged in the fires of these kinds of egregious forms of colonization are still getting privileged as truth. And they are implied as truth in opposition to Indigenous belief. So notice the way that people use these terms, fact or truth versus belief, and how belief gets denigrated. We don't think about Indigenous knowledge often as much as we think about Indigenous beliefs. So with this as background, it's obvious why the genome and other sciences with their considerable cultural power are viewed by Indigenous peoples as a potential threat. So I hope it's clear that this threat cannot be relegated to some simplistic understanding of science versus religion. or spirituality. That interpretation of Indigenous challenges to science is just intellectually lazy, and that science versus religion interpretation of our critiques is quite common. So when Indigenous critics exclaim, and this is me summing up what I've heard in the decades of work I've done around these issues, they might exclaim, "We will not stand by while our ancestors are desecrated in the name of scientific discovery," so human remains. Or when they say our creation stories and languages carry information about our genealogy and ancestors, we therefore don't need genetic testing or research to tell us where we come from. When Indigenous critics say these things, they're not simply expressing religious or cultural concerns. To characterize Indigenous critics as anti-science or as religious zealots not only misses their sophisticated historical analyses of power and their political insights, it also misunderstands Indigenous narratives of how our peoples emerged in particular locations on this planet, or even sometimes seeded by life from off-planet. I'm thinking about forms of life in particular places. It is to see those narratives as no different from the type of Christian creationism that challenges the biological sciences in school curricula. In the same way that scientific thinkers defend the veracity of the evolutionary narrative and scientific education against quote unquote creation science of some Christians, Indigenous critics call out scientists and the church alike for their missionary tactics and their distortion of Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous critics explain that settler colonial cultural and historical standpoints enacted through proselytizing scientific or Christian intellectual traditions are wielded as universal swords of truth over less powerful peoples. Indigenous critics see clearly the ideological bases in both scientific and clerical traditions, which were historically intimately entangled. Today, they are not as disentangled, those traditions, as their respective practitioners believe. Both science and the church claim the right to tell the only true story of human history. While the empirical data informing the two respective approaches might differ, they are both laden with long-standing narratives of Indigenous isolation, unenlightened thought, and Indigenous deficiency. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about a genetic genealogy listserv. Chapter 4 of my book is all on this listserv, and it's probably the most underengaged chapter in the book. I think it's actually pretty interesting, but so it's difficult for many non-Indigenous people, I think, to see what's clear to many of us. So on that day, back in April 2005, when the Indigenous Peoples Council on Biocolonialism issued their press release calling for a boycott of the Genographic Project and that sampling of 100,000 Indigenous people, a lively genetic genealogy listserv erupted in defense of Genographic. I was online nonstop for a couple of days around that. That listserv, which I did virtual ethnography on in 2004 and 5, was populated overwhelmingly by self-identified white or European Americans. And many of you out there will probably have a subscription to Ancestry.com. Back in the day before Ancestry.com, these listservs were really common where people were having similar types of conversations about how to map on DNA testing to their family tree documentation. So again, that listserv was populated overwhelmingly by self-identified white or European Americans. Recent ancestry in Europe was the most popular topic of conversation on that list. Interestingly, Native American ancestry was the second most popular. This tells you something about who can identify as Native and claim to be Native and remain white. I will say that there was not a single instance of anybody looking for recent African ancestry on that list, because of course that is not how white is defined, right? One drop rule. So that's a different way of racializing Native people versus Black people. So thinking about this listserv, right? You have all these self-identified white people, Anglo-American, WASP, whatever term they used, European American, it changed from person to person. They could also be looking for Native ancestry. So people like Elizabeth Warren and Joseph Boyden, with their claims as white people to being Indigenous because of ancestry alone, these are not unique claims. People like them are an epidemic, particularly across the south and east of the US. I can give you citations on that if you're interested. And in the eastern provinces of Canada, as Daryl LaRue has written about extensively, and that's a picture of his book on this slide. So I guess I kind of already got into this, but you can think about hypodescent, right, in which someone of any recent African ancestry should be categorized as Black and not white. But in contradistinction to that, US race politics have historically sanctioned the absorption of what I call red into the white body, both the individual and the national body politic. That race thinking informs a lot of federal Indian policy from the 19th century assimilationist policy. The Indian can be assimilated and made white. And that's pretty similar in Canada, as can be seen with the Indian Act, especially for Indigenous women, and the idea that they could be absorbed into whiteness. And this would also help lessen numbers of Indigenous people. So if you can't commit genocide through physical extermination, you can do it through bureaucratic processes. So to get back to the genealogy listserv, many of the genealogists online that day in 2005 had a deep understanding of genetic science, but they could not grasp the basics of Indigenous critiques. That Indigenous critics were not simply objecting to genome and migrations research contradicting Indigenous creation narratives, but rather Indigenous people were condemning the power that science has to define Indigenous histories, the relations that should matter, our identities, and it is feared then the power to determine our futures. Indigenous critics pointed out that Indigenous peoples are still subject to exploitation in research. This is not simply a past practice. And yet one lister, of a very vocal lister, had this to say. They said, there are some Indigenous people who fear anthropological DNA testing for pretty much the same reasons that some people fear genealogical DNA testing. They are comfortable with their myths and not particularly interested in investigating anything that might shake their worldview. Clinging to tradition is not something unique to Indigenous people. And then another lister added, my Mohawk ancestors believed that the world came into being on the back of a turtle. Subsequent evidence from a variety of data sources, such as the Hubble telescope, have proven this particular creationist theory to be incorrect. Archaeological and DNA evidence has allowed a robust but incomplete understanding of the correct origins of my ancestors. It is futile to play ostrich and ignore what is staring us in the face. When the evidence speaks loudly, one must listen or forever be clinging to false assumptions. Still, that does not in any way affect my deep respect for the traditions of my ancestors, but above all else, I want to know the truth. So again, Indigenous peoples and Christian perspectives that are critical of genome knowledge are often seen to fall on the same side of the religion versus science divide. But unlike Christianity, Indigenous peoples' origin narratives are often missing the will to convert, and so are without inherent tolerance for other narratives, be they biblical or evolutionary understandings of how the world comes into existence. Indigenous peoples often say they just want to be left alone to practice self-governance, including ceremonies, without having them outlawed or losing access to sacred sites through land and resource grabs. That's the story of colonization, those kinds of intentions by the settler state. So why is there resistance when Indigenous peoples are not doing the same kinds of proselytizing as Christian creationists? Now, certainly scientific thinkers don't have to worry about Indigenous people imposing our religions in public school classrooms to the detriment of biology education standards. Yet even with the balance of cultural power on their side, scientific thinkers are taught to believe that science and politics should be separated for the good of neutral science, that nature and culture are opposed, that one cannot be a rigorous thinker and indulge in politics. Of course, Indigenous critics, like feminists, call attention to the fact that politics are always already at the heart of any scientific enterprise. But being allergic to the recognition of power relations, and that's what I mean when I talk about politics, in the scientific enterprise, this no doubt impedes one's ability to truly grasp the political weight and the truth of Indigenous analyses. In addition to a politics allergy, scientific thinkers read Indigenous creation narratives in an overly simplistic manner when they reject, for example, accounts of a people emerging from a cave, or like that lister did with his pompous rejection of the idea of the turtle's back. They miss central propositions in such narratives that reveal how Indigenous peoples understand the world and our place in it. For example, Indigenous creation narratives provide values for living. They narrate a common history, and they cohere us as peoples and not simply human beings with a common moral framework. And go to the next slide. The other thing that I think that really needs to be recognized is that Indigenous narratives, stories about how the world comes into being, how it works or should work, are also materialist in how they recognize that we are produced of particular bodies of land and water, that continue to be necessary to sustain us as peoples. Thus, you can see how Indigenous concepts of peoplehood and ancestry go far beyond genetic ancestry, which is evidenced in the concept of a population. Our concepts of peoplehood involve sometimes biological, but also cultural and political groupings and definitions that have been constituted in long-standing dynamic relationship with living land and waterscapes that define our people's specific identities. While the concept of a genetic population might be complicated, so is the concept of an Indigenous people. They're both complicated forms of knowledge. One is not reducible to the other, and one does not supersede the other in terms of its truth value. So this is an important difference between the way that Indigenous peoples wield the idea of origins when we talk about that, and the way that human genome diversity wields the concept of origins. In fact, I actually think that Indigenous people attend more to ongoing relations than do genome science thinkers who, despite their evolutionary rhetoric and tipping their hat to environmental effects on the genome, actually, I think many genome science thinkers really do cling more to a static sense of origin than we do. So I'll give you an example. In human genome diversity narratives, landscapes or waterscapes are places through which humans and their molecules move and settle. An environment-human divide is presumed in the genomic narrative that is absent from the Indigenous narrative. Indigenous notions of peoplehood co-constituted with particular lands and waters differ from the concept of a genetic population, which is defined as moving upon or through landscapes. Indigenous peoples are also not given credit they deserve in these narratives for sailing over thousands of miles of open sea, millennia before so-called Europeans got it together to do the same. Therefore, it is true that Indigenous narratives challenge genomic narratives, but when read in all of their complexity, one can see the veracity present in Indigenous historical accounts and the debatable conceptual and material presuppositions in genomic narratives. Yet, Indigenous peoples do not expect scientists to adopt our stories and historical accounts. Again, ours are not proselytizing traditions. But we do want our political jurisdictions over our bodies, lands, and waters upheld. We are not broadly anti-experimentation or anti-technology, nor do we reject all new knowledge emerging from sciences. This is so obvious that it should not have to be stated, but we do want the power of our stories to shape our lives respected, to not be deemed as untruths. We want the space and the power to constitute knowledge in respectful relation with our worldviews. This is not how big S, I use big S science and little s science, this is not how big S science wants to work. So I'm going to quote a colleague, Jenny Reardon, from the Science and Justice Research Center at UC Santa Cruz. She has explained what she calls the central paradox of 21st century human genome research. And that is that it is presented as global and anti-racist, but it has actually advanced historically by violating subjects' right to self-governance, by appropriating their biological resources, their blood, their bones, the bodies of their ancestors, and sometimes even cultural narratives, and it has devalued the truths and powerful values of those it seeks to include and connect. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So in a 2017 chapter in the edited volume Cryopolitics, which is on MIT Press, I discuss how the accumulation and literal freezing of blood manifests the narrative of indigeneity frozen in time. Blood must be urgently drawn to preserve it for the coming extinction of Indigenous people. This is still a narrative that circulates widely, implicitly or explicitly. It is supposed that Indigenous peoples will eventually die off through admixture with non-Indigenous populations. When the time comes, frozen Indigenous blood will be subject to new research questions and more advanced technologies. So get all that blood that you can right now, because when Indigenous people are gone, we will no longer have access to it, and we'll need it in those frozen archives in order to study disappeared Indigenous people far into the future. I'm sure they're doing this with other non-human species that are becoming extinct too. So while ethical research processes are changing in relationship to human subjects, newer collaborative research remains conditioned by structural inequities between Indigenous peoples and those who study us, and we are largely studied by non-Indigenous scientists. The structural inequities are co-produced with settler hierarchies of life, wherein Indigenous peoples are commonly deanimated in genomic storytelling. death is ironically integral to the constitution of life as molecular. When we think about life as molecular, right, it's also predicated on Indigenous death. And this happens in both scientific discourse and in popular discourse. The molecular definition of life is built upon Indigenous bodies, that because we are expected to vanish, we are not really considered the beneficiaries of genomic futures. And so this is just showing some old visuals of that hierarchy of life that were in 19th century textbooks and in the science of the day. One of my pet peeves is this application of pseudoscience to the science of this time. This was cutting edge science in legitimate institutions. To call it pseudoscience today is to distance one's the responsibility of contemporary fields to that history. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And I just want to quickly talk about the notion of animacy and how that's being playing out in non-Indigenous materialisms right now. So there are non-Indigenous thinkers who are more critical, and I'm in conversation with these thinkers. People who know that they labor under the same life versus death, animate versus deanimate dichotomies that plague genome research. So these thinkers are questioning the terms animate and inanimate, the categorical divide between entities seen to live and those deemed as not alive. And they struggle with the fact that life in secular society is organismically defined. How then do they regard ethically entities in this world that do things to us and with us, but which are not defined as alive? And so in thinking with non-Indigenous thinkers on this issue, I encountered Mel Chen's work on the Animacy hierarchy. And I think Mel is still in gender and women's studies at UC Berkeley. And Mel refers to the greater and lesser relative degree of an entity's sentience, aliveness, self-awareness, and agency. Chen explores the greater and lesser aliveness attributed to some humans over others, to humans over non-humans. Chen is rethinking the life-death, animate-inanimate boundary, and in so doing disrupts human-animal, dynamism stasis, and subject-object binaries that underline what they call the animacy hierarchy. And Chen defines animacy as much more than the state of being animate. So for example, they think about mercury as animate and lead, the sort of action of lead poisoning in human and non-human bodies and what that does. So among materialist thinkers, Chen thinks more than most as well about the role of Indigenous thought in disrupting the animacy hierarchy, which is unsurprising, I think, because Chen also explores the roles of race and sexuality in shaping animacy in relation to humans, animals, living and dead things. I was saying last night on Twitter, I don't like when cops are called pigs, because this is totally stems from a denigration of animals, right? And certain humans get, well, of course we're all animals, but animal comes to be used as this sort of racial epithet, right? In a way that not only denigrates some humans, but it also denigrates non-human animals in that hierarchy of life. I think we should think more closely about that language and who and what we're denigrating. So on a final note as well, academic materialist thinkers, non-Indigenous thinkers like Mel Chen are really very clearly looking for a secular language to express the animacy of other than humans. The well-known new materialist writer Jane Bennett also explains that material vibrancy, in their words, is not a spiritual supplement of life force added to the matter said to house it. We can move to the next slide. So it's legitimate, right, if you're a secular thinker, to look for a secular language, to talk about animacy, one that avoids that kind of life forcey type language. But that's not something that Indigenous peoples necessarily need to do. And I like being in conversation with non-Indigenous thinkers on this, as well as we think about what languages we try to craft to adhere to our value frameworks, but that also can somewhat accurately represent the material world that we're engaging with. This is a really interesting conversation, I think, that's happening right now. Okay, so I can talk a little bit right now about interspecies thinking and being related. So I'm also in conversation between some of the multi-species ethnographers. So my friend Eben Kirksey has written several books on this, is currently working on a new one where they're thinking about applying anthropological approaches to studying multi-species organisms. So looking at how these kinds of non-human animals, plants and microbes have been relegated to the status of bare life or that which is killable, and how they're newly considering them alongside humans as shaping political, economic, and cultural forces. So Dorian Sagan, who I think is on this slide, is one of those people that has thought about interspecies communities. And he talks about he writes about symbiogenesis and the importance of microbes in constituting humans. And he explains that we're crisscrossed and cohabited by stranger beings, intimate visitors who affect our behavior, appreciate our warmth, and are in no rush to leave. And says, like all visible life forms, we humans are composites. And we hear this increasingly over the last 10 years. I think that quote's from about 2010, that a large percentage of our bodies are not actually human. So to my ear, these kinds of accounts, symbiogenesis and others, multi-species accounts, lead toward an ethos of we are all related. That humans and other than humans are network sets of social biological relations. And I go back to Vine Deloria Jr., pictured here, who was one of the most prominent Native American scholars of the 20th century, and what he described as an American Indian metaphysic. I mean, that's not a language we would necessarily use right now, but it's what he was using in the 1970s and 80s. And he talks about this American Indian metaphysic as a set of first principles we must possess in order to make sense of the world in which we live. And he talks about the realization that the world and all of its experiences constituted a social reality, a fabric of life in which everything had the possibility of intimate knowing relationships, because ultimately everything was related. So we can look at this kind of more philosophical Indigenous language and think about the way that that intersects with non-Indigenous materialist accounts today. You can begin to see how the spirit-material divide is not really adequate for thinking about how we are all in relation, both humans and non-humans. So I want to go to the next slide, 11. Look. So these are photos from my friend Craig Howe, who is a Noglala Lakota architect and a Lakota studies expert. He founded a research institute out on his family's land near the Rosebud Reservation in central South Dakota. He runs a lot of workshops there, and he has a blog called Oko Iawapi, or Week Count, instead of the winter count, which you might be familiar with. So in his digital weekly version of the traditional Lakota winter count, he blogs his engagements with different kinds of non-humans on his land, and you can see how beautiful it is. Rabbits, he talks about the rabbits who observe him when he works outside, or they take afternoon naps in the sun. He's got beautiful pictures on that blog. They also thwart his architectural projects with their own adamant digging, and there's a photo of that there. He also studies the lodges of spiders, which are akin to teepees in their form, and that's an upside down one there on the piece of wood. He follows the movements of what he calls star people in relation to distant buttes when he plots the structures of his facility. And he documents his relations with other than human persons, including those excluded in interspecies relations. So that might be stars. So it's just a kind of a tangible example of somebody who's still thinking in those really relational ways as they're going about their work that we might call in part cultural, but it's also scientific, right? As he does the kind of math and astronomy he needs to think about how to plot and build and design his structures on his land, having both an anthropological and architectural background. So we can go on to the next slide. This is just more on an Indigenous metaphysic. This is a turn of the 20th century, another Dakota thinker, Charles Eastman, who was using really Christian language here in this quote. But this is the turn of the 20th century when Indigenous intellectuals, Native intellectuals are really being funded by the church. And they have all been recently converted right after the end of the Indian Wars. In fact, Eastman was a doctor who attended injured at Wounded Knee, I believe. So this is the kind of world they were seeing. This is what they had seen, the kind of violence they had seen. They're newly converted to Christianity. And they're talking about these, what I would call an Indigenous metaphysic, but in ways that are also laden with Christian terminology, and we can understand why they would have done that. But he refers here not only to animals, but also energy, spirit, rocks, and stars in his relaying of the constitution of in thinking about Indigenous thought about the world. And again, I think this quote, again, reflects an understanding of the intimate knowing relatedness of all things. So I want to move to the next slide really quickly before I finish up, because it is almost 9:40. And this is a contemporary theorist who's helping me think through this language of spirituality, which I'm actually rejecting in my work. And in the next book, I want to go after nature, sex, and spirit and talk about why I think we need to think beyond these things as coherent objects and move back into a way of thinking in relation, because sexuality, spirituality, and nature are all forms of being in relation. If we can think about the interplay, the intersubjectivity of different entities in relation. And that's what David Shorter is getting at in his work on both spirituality and sexuality. He and I are also editing a special issue of an American Indian Culture and Research journal right now. So we really do think a lot together these days. So I wanted to say too, before getting into this quote really quickly, my colleague at the University of Alberta, Jessica Cryopolitics, who works on the Indigenous Science Studies Initiative there with me, she doesn't use the word spirit, she calls them energetic remains. And I love that terminology. I like it much better than spirit for all of the reasons that David Shorter gives in this quote. And he explains that critical analyses of oral stories and earliest ethnographic accounts continue to reveal that rather than being spiritual, Native people were relating. He says it's less cumbersome than intersubjective. Related might best replace spiritual. One's relations are not solely related by blood or tribal heritage. They provide meaning and identity beyond confines of race, tribe, and species. In these ways, being related offers more than any abstract notion of religion or spirituality ever could. And you really see that demonstration of being in relation in Craig Howe's Oko Iawapi week count. So I also just want to add one thing too. I think Shorter is pointing towards this, that the idea of being related is a welcome correction to the overly used idea of identity. That's another word that I avoid using. One of my concerns is that our focus on so-called identity, especially in DNA conversations, that it's a concept that is derived from and loops back to privilege, lineal genetic descent, solely from human ancestors. Identity tends to be human-centric and less relational. It diverts our focus from ongoing becoming, from being in good relation with not only other humans, but more than human relatives and with the planet. Identity instead tends to invoke some kind of original essence that does not necessarily require ongoing good relating in order to then claim that so-called identity. In short, identity as a concept is a poor substitute for relations. And I wonder, therefore, if the notion of Indigenous identity is not actually paradoxical. So this is sort of me dancing across the different topics and disciplinary approaches featured in my next book that will really focus on relational analytics that are prominent in the growing and vibrant field of Indigenous studies. Really, relational frameworks are very much coming to the fore from whatever Indigenous tradition they are coming from, and there are multiple across the globe. And I also just wanted to say too that I'm also really deeply indebted to especially younger queer, two-spirit, trans thinkers who are also working hard to make and theorize what counts as good relations beyond these kinds of categories that are shaped in the ways that I have talked about today. Okay, I'll be done now and we can talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. TallBear. That was so thought-provoking, and there are lots of elements that we can be reflective of and digest in the coming days, weeks, and years, I believe. Often, facing with all this enormous dichotomy, or in a way, kind of conflicting ideas and so much of divisions that we face, the moving ahead, generating or imagining the path together in a future is very overwhelming and sometimes very daunting task. But your talk kind of gave us a little bit of hints, where we can start and then where we are going, and what are the kind of different ways that we can seek for the path ahead of us. So I'd like to really thank you for taking time and joining us today and to share your thoughts. And, we have like 15 more minutes at least. So I'd like to open up the floor for this opportunity to engage the further conversation with the, Dr. TallBear. Okay, Sean, I see Sean, your hands are up. So when, to accommodate your question, please, make your question pretty succinct.
Thank you so much for your very interesting talk, Dr. TallBear. My question is, maybe you could provide a few recommendations. There's a lot of non-Indigenous researchers that want to engage with Indigenous research, but aren't clear on how to do that in a way that doesn't reinforce colonial practices. And so I was wondering if you could provide some recommendations or best practices for non-Indigenous researchers that might be interested in engaging with research on Indigenous populations, or if they have graduate students that are interested in engaging with Indigenous populations. How do we do that in a way that's not oppressive, marginalizing, and reinforcing some of the problems of colonialism, or the problems of colonialism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is an expanding literature on Indigenous methods, right? That puts forward different conceptual frameworks, but that's one level. The other level is the actual practice of it and the making relations, right? This is, I think, it's very difficult if you haven't, it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. I tend to work with non-Indigenous researchers as collaborators, say people in the med school or public health at the U of A, who have already learned the hard lessons, right? I've learned the difference between, I don't try to collaborate anymore, for example, with scientists who've never worked in Indigenous communities, because I don't have the time to teach them. So in some sense, the best non-Indigenous researchers are the ones that have taken the hard knocks, but they will probably tell you that that was very difficult for both them and the Indigenous people they worked with. One of the things I think that's critical for helping the university work in it with Indigenous communities is having people high up in the administration. This is going to sound boring, but this is key. So all these moves to hire Indigenous initiatives people and placing them in the president's office is key, and not just any Indigenous person. I think it's really important to have people that have long-standing networks and relations in those communities. So at the University of Alberta, we not only have people in Native Studies, we're a faculty and we have our own dean, we have all our own staff, we have elders on contract, we have people that are deeply rooted in this place, in this region. We also have that in the President's office, in the new Indigenous Initiatives office. And again, we've got Cree, Métis, and Inuit people who are the populations that are, the Indigenous populations that are here now, staffing those positions. And even as a Dakota person who came from the US, like, I can't just go out and work in Indigenous communities up in Alberta or Saskatchewan, right? I don't have those relations. I go first and foremost to those people that do. So what elders should I get in touch with? How should I get in touch with people? And really what enables us to do a better job, I think, at the U of A than a lot of places, is having those administrative structures in place. So I really encourage you at your university to advocate for those things. It's going to help all of you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another person who raised the hand with the name of D. Tashrell at University of Toronto. Could you please identify your name and affiliation and ask a question?
Hi, yeah, I'm Danielle Tashrell-Mamers, and I don't know why that's a U Toronto address because I'm at McMaster now, but too many emails. Anyways, Dr. TallBear, I was so enthused by the way that you are using relations to displace the idea of identity. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more. I'm interested in how you might see that working, relations working between settler and Indigenous communities through things like treaty and other agreements, as well as with non-human communities. So I've been doing some work with the Buffalo Treaty in the West, and I think there might be similar parallels with how the Mi'kmaq are trying to govern their sustainable fishery. Yeah, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit about treaty and legal agreements.
You mean as forms of relating? I mean, it's not really my area. I'm really interested in what people who know more about that would have to say, because I have to say, like, moving up here, we don't talk about treaties in the US in the same way. We talk about them as nation-to-nation agreements. And one of the things that's been really interesting to me, and I really was like, it was like a light bulb went on over my head when I read Rob Innes's book, Elder Brother, and it's related to Cowess's First Nation. And he talks about, and many Indigenous people up here talk about treaties as forms of not only nation-to-nation agreements, but historical ways of making kin, right? That blew my mind because I think about treaty making as kind of adversarial nation to nation type difficult negotiation stuff. So I mean, you all, I think those of you up here who work on this kind of stuff know a lot more than I do about treaty as a form of, like when they say we're all treaty people, this is all new to me. So I don't know that I can answer that question, but I think it's really fascinating. And I do think I hear a lot of Indigenous thinkers up here talking about treaties in exactly that way. I need to do the reading though of others. Sorry, that's a cop-out.
No worries, thank you.
Good question though.
Thanks. Next we have Heidi Swanson.
Hi, Dr. TallBear. Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I think I'm going to have to listen to the recording about 5 times to catch it all. But I was actually wondering, you very briefly at the beginning mentioned discussing and some resources that are available for discussing the difference between objectivity and neutrality. And I'm a natural scientist trying much harder to build relational practices into most of my research is in the Canadian Arctic. And so I was just wondering if you could point towards some of those resources for kind of engaging in that discussion.
Yeah, I can. They're probably very opaque to people who are not trained in social theory, right? So they're, the classic people that I work with are people who work on, who were scientists or feminist philosophers of science. So Donna Haraway gets cited a lot, as well as Sandra Harding. I kind of summarize some of that stuff in the introduction to my book, Native American DNA. So, and I'm trying to think, it's not that you have to read me, but I'm trying to think of who summarizes that and applies it directly to a field that is a bit easier to get through. But there's a couple of key readings that people often cite by Haraway and Harding from like 1988 to 1991 is when this stuff was really being published a lot. But I would not recommend starting with those. So yeah, if you want to go to the intro to my book, that'll give you a sense. And I probably cite some other people as well. The other person I cited, Jenny Reardon, Reardon. She also writes on human population genetics stuff, and she comes out more out of sociology and has worked in genome policy stuff. So she also works with those frameworks and might be more accessible for somebody who's coming out of the natural sciences and isn't as familiar with our language. She's wonderful. I think you'd really enjoy her work. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Great. So I have a few more hands up. I see a few more hands up, but I also received one question from the chat. So I'd like to introduce a question from the chat. So it's very kind of simple, but see. This is from Larry Hanta. The question is relational genomics possible? Does metagenomics, looking at all DNA ecosystem or the native biodata consortium? I don't know if you're familiar with, but then those are the kind of a pathway forward towards the better science. That's the question.
Well, I'm not familiar with those exactly, but yes, I would say I am one of the founding faculty members for the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING, which was founded in the US in 2011. We've since founded programs in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada, and we have now a global SING consortium, and there's also people within our network working on the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. There's a lot that's happened in the last 20 years, and particularly as Indigenous scientists get trained in these fields. And also, and when I said I'm influenced by other kinds of critical scientists, so feminist scientists, Black scientists, queer scientists, people who have also had historical critiques of the way their bodies and populations have been marginalized in science and exploited, are also thinking in really critical ways about how to do science differently. So there is a lot of exciting stuff happening right now. And that goes back to this chicken and egg problem. I think it is actually really important to diversify the laboratory, but that in and of itself is not enough. We must also diversify the frames of thought that people are coming from, right? And we are seeing more of that happening, although it's been difficult work. So yes, I think, and then thinking about what relational genomics looks like, that's a really good phrase. And I will start to think about that as I'm looking at the work that we're doing. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So we have 3 more people hands up, and we have 6 more minutes. So I'm hopeful that we can get through. So we have Christine, Howard, and Audrey. So let's go with Christine.
Bonjour, thank you, Kim. I'm a big fan of yours. I follow a lot of your talks on podcasts when I can grab them in various disciplines. So thank you.
Thanks.
I want to talk very briefly about the word spirit. I'm a movement performance artist, and in my work and somatic work, I understand attuning to energies. But in the academia, I prefer using the word spirit because it still scares a lot. Specifically the experts, and because they will refer me to doing religious studies or while working or speaking in the place of Indigenous people, absorbing them in my own writing as if it was my own experience. They also don't like to think about the little people and the fairies that I might see and perform in my dance. They want it to be literature and fiction. So I just want to note that I continue to use the word spirit, even as I see that you're moving towards the word energy, until the settlers can figure out a little bit more their fear of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's only one word. What I advocate is that particularly my students who work in Indigenous languages, so we have a really strong Cree language program, but within Indigenous studies, wherever it is, I think it's important to also foreground the language, the local and regional Indigenous languages, and to think in those languages, and our students are doing that. So while I may like that term energetic remains, that's not the only term. What I really want them to do is dig into the language and think about how are these beings and relations talked about in the language. It's in those, because the translations are so bad in English, right? Both culturally bad and just there is no one-to-one translation often for these words. And so if you can begin to work and think in Indigenous languages a bit, you'll bring forward mind-blowing and very different worldviews, right? And frameworks and terms for thinking about things. So I think the important thing is to just be clear when you use the word spirit, what exactly are you thinking about and what do you mean? And is that the best word for you? And it sounds like you have a strategic reason for using that word. But there might also be better ways of thinking about that. And Shorter gets into that in his article, Spirituality. It's really an interesting article. So yeah, thank you for that.
Great. So in the interest of time, maybe we can get two questions together and then see the answer from the Dr. TallBear. So Howard goes first and Audrey.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, Dr. TallBear. You already sort of begun answering my question before asking it, but I'm going to ask it nonetheless, which is, what are the roles of people like Donna Haraway and her notion of Thulacene, or people like Bruno Latour and actor network theory in terms of translating and creating reconciliation to translate to a Western dominant science?
Okay.
So Audrey?
Ani, bonjour, Kim, Audrey Indishnikas, Makwa Dodam, and Takaranto Megwa. So thank you so much. My name is Audrey. I'm coming in from the University of Toronto today. I am Anishinaabe and Makwa, our Bear clan here in Ontario. So my question to you is, in my role at the University of Toronto, I work with Indigenous partnerships and relations, specifically with Woodsworth College. And often I love your talk on animacy and inanimacy and that dichotomy that people find very, very hard to understand. In my language in Anishinaabe-Moan, it is rooted in that dichotomy of animate and inanimate, and there are often no translations, as you noted. So when I bring partnerships together, to your point, to look at, are people ready as a partner to go down certain conversations with some of the Indigenous community here and beyond the walls of the university, I often explore those views of animacy and inanimacy through my own worldview. So I try to explain to people that the concept of all my relations and that philosophy of everything being related. And that's a lot that you talked a lot about that today. And sometimes instead of me having a teachable moment, I was wondering if there was a resource or an academic that writes from an Indigenous perspective that may be able to help some of my allies understand that dichotomy a little bit better without going into language experts, because certainly I do put them on the road of some of the great language instructors that we have here at the university. But I was wondering if there is a source that, an Indigenous source that could explore that maybe I can send people a link as a resource before we can get ready for partnerships.
Let me check with my grad students. Will know more about that than I will. Actually, that's a really good question, and I could use that source too. So if you don't mind maybe sending me an email, I will remember to check in with all my grad students and figure out if there's anybody that I should read and you can read too. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And then I'll just quickly answer the other question because we're almost out of time. Latour doesn't seem to know that Indigenous people exist. I mean, I do use him, but he's just like, and Donna Haraway well, she was also one of my PhD advisors, so full disclosure. But she does think about indigeneity, and it has moved more in recent years to engaging with Indigenous relationality. And so Donna has been very useful for me in terms of thinking about feminist critiques of science, and I think feminists theorize hierarchies in science officially and academically before Indigenous people did, although we do it in community. So I really am in conversation with her work. And I think it is useful for non-Indigenous people. Both of them are, and a lot of that science studies work is really useful, but it's partial. And I would also argue that people should not act like this is new. Indigenous people didn't forget these ways of being in relation just because there's lots of non-Indigenous people now that are coming back to so-called new materialisms, right? So, but yeah, I'm in conversation with all of it. Thank you.
Wow, great. Thank you so much for all the great questions and interesting conversation. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Patrick to close the session.
Yeah, just another thank you to Dr. TallBear for spending the hour with us. And thank you to everyone else for joining us as well. A reminder that we did record the session, and so you'll be able to find a recording on our department's website soon. And finally, the next colloquium in our series takes place next Friday, same time, 11 a.m., same place, Zoom. And our own department's Dr. Kate Choi will be talking about inequality in the COVID-19 pandemic. So once again, thank you, Dr. TallBear, and thank you to everyone else as well.
Thanks.